Back. This is the San Francisco Dharma Collective, and I'm MC Owens. And tonight, what we're going to do is we're sort of going to continue the conversation from last week, sort of, but we're going to talk about a whole new thing tonight. So, the topic tonight that we're going to talk about is sort of actually like it's sort of two topics, but they're the same topic. So, we're going to be talking about dependent origination and emptiness. So, but like I just said, those are kind of the same idea, actually. So that's hopefully what we will get to by the end of the evening is how it is that dependent origination and emptiness are actually the same thing. But I have, in many ways, a very, like, in my mind, a clear goal tonight. So I want to talk about dependent origination. And I want to talk about how it relates to emptiness, but I kind of only have one goal, which is it's sort of the point of this new Sunday night class, which is to try to make this applicable to our lives, right? To try to make this practical in some way. And I got to tell you, dependent origination is probably going to be one of the hardest things to do in an hour and a half. So it's not that it's you can't do it. It's just it's a big idea. So I have a few notes, but I'm going to try to keep it super focused and allow me to kind of introduce like the question that I'm trying to answer tonight. So I got a few questions over this week regarding dependent origination. Um, Robin, as usual, you sent some great questions, so I want to reference them a little bit. So I got a question from Robin, and she actually has taken, excuse me, I've taught a course on dependent origination. I teach it every now and then. It's like a little 6-week course on this idea. Robin took my course, so she had a question that was kind of remaining from that. And what it was is that in that class, I mentioned something kind of really important. And what it is that, and this is as far as I can tell, but in the world of Buddhism, we have these like different ideas, like we've been talking about uh, pranya or prajna, right? The idea of wisdom. And that's the, excuse me, that's the third category of the teachings that I didn't get to last week. We kind of went back and we're talking about morality, we were talking about meditation, but we didn't quite get to talking about prajna, the aspect of wisdom. Well, what I was going to talk about last week was dependent origination and emptiness. But there's another word that is used within the world of Buddhism. It's a very important word, and it's the word buddhi, awakening. It is the Bodhi, buddhi. It's the same, it's the root of the word for Buddha, an awakened one, right? So the idea of a awakened being, the idea of awakening, well, as far as I can tell, the sort of standard dictionary definition, a Buddhist dictionary definition of buddhi, like what is Bodhi? What is awakening? It is understanding dependent origination, like specifically. And I say this because you may have heard of something in the world of Buddhism that they call a pratyeka Buddha, a pratyeka Buddha, or a solitary enlightened Buddha. And what they talk about regarding the pratyeka Buddha, the solitary Buddha, well, what makes a pratyeka Buddha a pratyeka Buddha? They figure out dependent origination. So it's a really big deal, is what I'm getting at. That like that to understand dependent origination is tantamount to enlightenment. And so there's this question that Robin had that it was from the course that I gave. And what it was is that she has some questions about sort of seeing, let's call it seeing, dependent origination. And in particular, she referenced something that I said about awakening, about enlightenment. And what it is, and I stand by this, for me, my understanding of awakening or enlightenment, the way that I understand that is that in the process of awakening, nothing really changes out out there, so to speak. Meaning it's going to be the same world in that way. The difference is going to be how you feel about it. In other words, if the world and the things of the world and the events of the world and the news of the world, if that's like, oh, making you very sad, but then some things make me really happy, but other things make me really sad, that is sort of being turned around by the world in that way. As one moves towards awakening, it's gonna, in a way, be the same world, but the way you relate to it, your disposition towards it, is what changes. And eventually moving more and more towards a calm state of equilibrium where the world is not turning us all around. And ultimately, one can reach the state of a Buddha in which nothing triggers a Buddha. Nothing gets under a Buddha's skin in that way. So the Buddha is a Buddha is entirely at peace with everything in that sense. So I said this, I made this statement. I make this statement a lot about enlightenment because I don't think it's about, you know, visualizations of deities and these things like that. I don't think it's any different than this in that way. But in saying that, Robin had a question, and what it was is she had a question regarding feelings, and she used the language of feelings because I even used that language of it's going to change how you feel about things. And so Robin asked me about those feelings and sort of basically, this is a really, really good, important question. She was asking that basically in a kind of more meditative mind, a meditative approach, are those feelings about the world, are they to be sort of examined and learned from? Or are they to be like ignored, so to speak? Good question. I would say that there's probably many different kinds of Buddhist teachers, and that some would encourage you to study these things, some would encourage you to ignore them. But I'm going to give you my answer to that question. But before I do that, we need to have a quick conversation about some words. And this, by the way, this Sunday night class is Buddhism in translation. So we have to have a little bit of talk about words and translation and all of that. So let's start with the idea of feelings really quickly. I'm going to keep coming back to this, but let me clarify. So the word feelings, phew, that's a tricky word. It's a tricky word, and because we use this word in English, but it has a very like amorphous, it has very amorphous boundaries, feelings. It's like, are they emotional? Are they like tactile and physical? Like, what exactly is a feeling? Well, if we go back to sort of our Buddhism, we might be talking about two different things. So one of the things that we might be calling feelings, one of the things that we might be talking about is what we call Vedana. And Vedana is indeed usually translated as feelings, but I prefer to translate it as sensations because one of the things that we are talking about with Vedana are we are definitely talking about sensory organs and sort of like stimulus from the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and brain. Remember, in Buddhism, the brain is a sensory organ, not unlike the eyes and the ears, just different sensory object. But the idea is that we are indeed sensing from those six sensory organs, but Vedana is specifically kind of the feeling tone of the sensation. In other words, is it pleasurable or painful or neutral? So, in talking about feelings, we might be talking about how I feel about what I'm seeing. Maybe it's beautiful. It's like it's captivating. Well, if it's captivating and beautiful, that is a positive Vedana. It might be beautiful music. It might be a wonderful smell. It might be a great taste. It might be a wonderful, warm bath. It might be a delightful thought. So those are the six possible sensations and examples of positive feelings, but positive Vedana. Or, of course, we could hear something that makes us upset, smell something, and so on. There's also, by the way, of course, a sound that just whoop, and it doesn't make us upset. It doesn't really get us super excited. It's just a sound. So that's that third category of a neutral sensation. Okay, so that's Vedana, feelings, but there's another word that we might be referring to as feelings. And that would be the deeper idea of a samskara, that idea of a conditioned state or a habit, right? And at that point, we're talking about sort of like conditioned instinctual behavior in a certain way. And at that point, we might be talking about something more, we might be talking about something closer to the idea of like a disposition towards something. And by disposition, it's a little more complicated than just I like it, I don't like it, right? It's like when we have a disposition towards something, it's at least I think of it as more complicated in that way. So we might be talking about Vedana, we might be talking about samskara. We're probably talking actually about both, because in Buddhism, of course, we develop dispositions towards things based upon their feeling tones, right? And so if I enjoy a nice warm bath, that's a pleasant Vedana, then my disposition towards hot water and bathrooms and showers and all these things, I'm very disposed towards them in that sense. So just want you to notice that kind of relationship between those two. Either way, either way, whether we're talking about a positive, negative, or neutral Vedana sensation, or a sort of positive, negative, or neutral disposition based upon our samskara, tonight, what we're going to be talking about is this idea of things making me feel certain ways. That's what we're talking about tonight. That's my laser focus tonight. Now, in order to make this a very practical lesson, I have to digress for a little bit. So I promise you we're going to come back to this. All right. But it, all right, so dependent origination, it's one of those things. So let's start. A little bit of language, a little more language, I should say. So tonight, we're talking about something called pratitya samutpada. Pratitya samutpada. And that word, which is a big compound term, is two parts. Pratitya, actually three parts, I'm sorry. Pratitya sam utpada. Now, the first part of that, pratitya, the root of that word is prati, and it means like it does mean like dependent upon. It does mean based on. So it's the idea of dependent or based on. And that dependent or based on is then modified by this idea of sam utpada. Utpada, just the end of this word, UTP long ADA, utpada. Utpada means to be born. It literally means to have your feet up in the air, I believe, to have your feet raised. My the amount of etymology I could do today, it makes it seem like it has to do with a baby coming out with the feet up and the head down. So that's the etymology is about feet up, but it means birth. And I think the way that we get from feet up to birth is that kind of image of a baby being born upside down. So regardless of the deeper etymology, udpada means to like be born, to arise, to come about. So it's that idea of like coming about. But utpada is modified by this idea of sam utpada. And sam, as you probably know in Sanskrit, it means same. It's where we get the English word same. It comes from this Sanskrit sam. So sam utpada, same birth, born at the same time. Born at the same time, independence on each other. So pratitya samutpada. Samutpada via pratitya. That's the idea. So dependent co-origination. That is the pretty normal translation of this idea of pratitya samutpada. You also, though, hear codependent origination. You hear interdependent origination. You hear dependent causation, interdependent causation. This gets translated so many different ways. Allow me to explain what it is they're talking about. Like, what is this idea of pratitya samutpada? Well, it's kind of in the name. This is about origination. I called it, or they call it, we call it dependent origination. So, origination, we're talking about where things come from. Where do things come from? This is the biggest philosophical question that you could possibly ask, and people have been asking this forever and ever and ever. It could be reduced down to why. The question why. That's what we're talking about tonight. It's huge, is my point. Like this is no little matter. Okay, so tonight, in talking about dependent origination, we are talking about where things come from according to Buddhism. So I need us to kind of understand that we are talking about a very deep, deep aspect of reality because we're talking about something that wasn't there, something that wasn't there a moment ago. And now it's here. And we're asking, where did it come from? How did it come about? All right. So that's what we're talking about. Now, in order to kind of move us towards a more practical understanding of this, I do need to share with everybody some abstract ideas for a moment. So just I'm gonna get out some examples. I'm getting out the whiteboard just for a moment. And for a little while, you're going to be like, wait a minute, what does this have to do with anything? But I promise you, I'm bringing us back. But we need to talk about this idea of causation or origination. So here's, and you've seen this before, some of you, but not all of you who have. And if you haven't, if seen this in a while, it's good to think about it. So I'm going to do my classic example of dependent origination real quick. And we're going to talk about that. And the question is what is that? Right? Now, at this point, maybe it's obvious what it is, or you might say it's obvious in that way, right? But I'm going to do this really quickly. So I didn't do anything to the original thing, right? The original thing that I asked about when I was like, what is that? I didn't do anything to it, right? I sort of did something over here. But now I want you to notice that we might have a sense of what that is. And the idea is that you now might think that this is a letter, and you might think that it's the letter I. Okay. But now I want to quickly show you a Buddhist magic trick. It's a dependent origination magic trick. And then we're going to talk about it real quick. So the magic trick is keep your eye on the I. Like keep a really clear look at the letter I. All right? Keep your eye on it. All right. So you see the letter I? And you might notice that it looks a little bit like a number now. That it looks a little bit like the number one all of a sudden. And what I want you to notice, or the question is, what caused that? What is the origin of the now number one? Because a second ago, I thought it was the letter I. And now it's a number, and I want to know where it came from. I want to know where it came from, and I want to know what caused it. Now, here's the thing about it. You might think that this is the number 8, and you might think that when I added that little curved line and I made this the 8, you might think that it was the number eight that like caused that to become the number one. Like that it used to be the letter I, but it shifted because of the now number eight. Everybody follow me on this idea of causation? But here's the thing about that. Let me get a little. Here's the thing about that idea, the idea that it was the number eight that caused this transition. But here's the thing about that. What's that? Maybe a curved line, maybe a little snake. Who knows, really, right? But if I do that, meaning I put a straight line next to it, now it's looking like an S. It's looking like it's the letter S now. And the thing about it is that you might think that it was because I drew the letter I that it caused that to be the letter S. But we already did this. It was this that caused this. And that is our first example of dependent origination. It's the idea that they simultaneously both cause each other. And one of them doesn't have priority. It's not that any one of them was there already, and then based upon that, this one happened. It was a co-origination. The I and the S, or the 1 and the 8, co-originated. One did not cause the other in that way. Okay, everybody follow me on that? We have one more place to go though. That's a good one. So dependent origination is complicated. And it's complicated because the first level is understanding that the I and the S are co-creating each other to be those letters. But then what I really want you to notice is the word. Now, what I want you to notice is I want you to notice two things about the word. One is that the word is singular, but it's sort of made out of these two letters. So I want you to be noticing that you have these two parts, and then you have the whole. All right? But remember what we just said about the parts, that they were co-originating? Well, that kind of means that the whole is also co-originating. Meaning that now it's kind of like a whole little world, right? So the first thing I wanted you to notice is that we have a singularity in terms of the word, but in terms of the letters, we have two. But the other thing that I want you to notice, what word is that? It's the English word for to be, to exist. And I want you to notice that from a Buddhist point of view, existence, and by right now, I'm actually speaking in many levels because I'm talking about what this word means, but I'm also talking about the word itself, meaning the existence of a word, and I'm talking about the letters. So all of that we are looking at as dependently originated. Everybody with me on this? By the way, also with this one, you also have just one number, interestingly, because last time I checked, 18 is a number. But interestingly, that singular number is made up of the two numbers. And once again, it is all being dependently originated in the sense that it's all resting on the rest of it. All right, everybody got this? We're moving on to the next example. Because that one, I like to start with that one to get us thinking. But that one's a little abstract. Let's take it a little bit further and let's talk about this one. So what I want you to notice is that there's the exact same thing as the 1 and the 8 or the I and the S. There's the exact same thing going on here, which is let's work with this part. Now, if you think that this is a wah, 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 if you think this is a duck, then you think that this is the duck's bill. And if you think that this is a duck's bill, and you think this is a duck, then you probably think that these are feathers, and it's feathery. But if it's a bunny rabbit, then these are ears, and this is fur. All right? But what I want you to notice is this is dependent origination. It's the craziest thing that you could possibly think about. But I want you to notice that my example of the I and the S and the 1 and the 8, it's happening here because if I asked you, what is that? And you said, well, it's a duck. And if I said, but how did you know it was a duck? And you said, well, it has a bill and feathers. If I asked you, how did you know that that was a bill? You'd probably say, well, because it's a duck. But if I asked you, but wait, how did you know it was a duck? You'd say, well, because it has a bill. And I want you to notice that the bill and the feathers are just like the letters, one in the I and the S. And then we have the duck. That's like the word is, or the number 18. You following me on this? Where we have the whole, like the whole, whether it was the word is or the number 18, and now we have a duck, and that's the whole. But notice that you think in terms of that whole because of the parts, but you only think that those are the parts of a duck because you've already thought it was a duck based upon the parts. You see the infinite feedback loop going on here? What I just called that infinite feedback loop, that is about what I said a moment ago too, regarding the I and the S and the 1 and the 8. I said that there's no priority. And by priority, I mean prior, like before. The best way to describe this might be to talk about that dependent origination is simultaneous. In other words, the I and the S, whoop, come together. The feathers and the bill and the duck all come together. Now, the same thing happens, of course, when I do the rabbit, right? Because I say, how did you know it was a rabbit? Well, it had long ears. How did you know those were ears? Well, because they were on a rabbit. And how'd you know it was a rabbit? And it just goes around and around and around. Okay, so that's level two. Everybody with me? Okay, so now I can walk us through the next level of this. And now we're getting closer to the answer to this question of how to relate to things in that way. So I'll keep using this one. And many of you have probably heard this one before, but again, it never hurts to hear it again. I want you to think about a situation where, and I always pretend like you and I, we're hanging out over here at my house, and there's, oh, knock at the door. Let's go see who it is. And we both look through the peephole, and I see, but you see, or let me say, I see the wah, wah, I see a duck because I saw bill and feathers. You saw a little bunny rabbit because you saw furry long-eared being. All right. Now, there's layers to this. The first layer is that I saw a duck, you saw a rabbit. But the next layer to this is when I say, whatever you do, don't open the door. And you say, why not? We should let it in. And I'm going, no, we shouldn't. So, in other words, I'm having a negative Vedana. I'm having a negative reaction to this duck. Meanwhile, you're having a positive reaction to this little bunny rabbit. But here's the backstory. The idea is that when I was a child, my parents took me to a petting zoo and they gave me this really nasty duck. And I was petting this duck and it bit me. Ah, and it was the worst day of my childhood. So ever since then, I don't like ducks so much. But funny, when you were a child, you also went to a petting zoo, but they gave you a little furry bunny rabbit. And for you, bunny rabbits, it's like that was like the best day of your childhood. So the association, the samskara, the disposition that you have for bunny rabbits, it's very different than the samskara, the reaction that I have to ducks. All right. So I see duck, I get nervous. I don't want to let it in. You see bunny rabbit, you get excited, you want to let it in. All right. Now let's examine this from the perspective of dependent origination. So from the level of dependent origination, and I want to say, I'll say this now because I'll forget if I don't. There's, from the perspective of dependent origination, there's something very, very interesting going on. And what it is so you have to remember some things that I was just talking about. In particular, the thing I just said about no priority, that it doesn't come first. Well, in the normal situation, in the normal way of thinking, I walked over to the door, I looked through the peephole, I saw a duck, and the duck made me upset. So the duck made me upset. Whereas for you, the little bunny rabbit may caused you, there's that language, but the little bunny rabbit caused you to be excited or to be happy. That's the way that we normally think. But from the perspective of dependent origination, here's what's really interesting. When you looked through the peephole, or when I looked through the peephole, it's not that the duck made me nervous. And it's not that I got nervous and therefore imagined I saw a duck. They arose simultaneously. Let me walk you through that again because it's tricky. One way of thinking is that the duck caused caused me to be upset. There's another way of thinking, though, which is that I got upset and that was the cause of a hallucination. Like that would be a way of thinking it, that the fear caused this hallucination of a duck. What I'm telling you from a Buddhist point of view of dependent origination is nope. The fear or anxiety about the duck and the duck, whoop, arise at the same time. There is no priority. Now, there's a couple of levels to this. The first level is we need to kind of go back to where it was me and you. And we need to go back to the fact that I was having a negative reaction and you were having a positive reaction. So just at that level alone, it's very difficult or I would say it's problematic at that point for me to say that it's what's on the other side of the door. That's what's causing me to be upset. But that's not entirely true though, because you're seeing something entirely different and having an entirely different reaction to it. So what I'm getting at is that from that point of view, it's erroneous to think that my feeling of anxiety is being caused by something. Because I'm the very one that's fabricating that thing to begin with. So it can't be being caused by something else exactly. Does that make sense, that idea that based upon dependent origination, it's just not wise to think that things are what are causing me to be angry or upset or whatever? It is dependent origination. Okay, I have a few things written down, so I want to say them now because I'll forget. So Robin's initial question regarding, okay, so let's say we're thinking about dependent origination. And let's say I'm meditating, and let's say something, whether it's a thought or an object or whatever, but let's say it's making me upset. Robin's original question is like, okay, so should I like contemplate and examine that? And is there like a benefit to understanding that? Or is it the cause of the anxiety in that way and to be kind of ignored, not in a repressive way, but just in a non-entertaining way, right? And what I wrote down is so in terms of so should I contemplate this phenomena as like a source of information for and Robin used the language of to be in touch with. Should I try to be in touch with my feelings regarding things? And the answer is yes. Yes, in terms of understanding that whatever it is upsetting you, understand that that's a misunderstanding and a misunderstanding that is causing this. So should you examine it in terms of info? Yes. Should you ignore it and see it as a distraction? Yes, that too. Why? Because it's a great misunderstanding that's causing your whatever you're feeling. So it's actually both in that way, if that makes sense, Robin. And what I mean is that insofar as it has your attention, yes, you should wisely be aware of its dependently originated origin in that way. But because it is ultimately sort of false or delusional in that way, it would be wiser just to not really entertain it. If that makes sense. I have more, but I want to pause. Any questions, comments, or ideas about anything we've talked about so far? And I do have a few more replies to questions, but Maria,
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, good. I'm trying a new speaker because the old stuff wasn't working right, and now this one's crackling a little bit, so I just want to make sure you can hear me.
I can.
Okay, excellent. Um, so I am just sort of bringing in some other things that we've talked about, and over the years now, and I want to make sure that I'm understanding what's sort of underneath it.
Hmm.
So the line on the whiteboard is neither a one nor an I, and or it's both. And so first lost my train of thought. So it's so that if it's neither or both, it seems like it's like at the heart of the Madhyamaka teaching. It sounds a lot like it both exists and it doesn't exist, which or it both exists and it doesn't not exist. It both does. You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying for sure.
um, so it feels like that. It feels like that's underneath it. It's really at the heart of it. It's we're back at the beginning of this conversation, and we're talking about emptiness.
I haven't mentioned emptiness yet. Maria, by the way, you are talking about emptiness, and I'm about to get there. But let me mention one more thing real quick based upon what Maria just said. Let me
Okay.
clarify. I want to I didn't, I missed one part of this, which clearly I should have mentioned. And what it is, um, so what we did is, where's everything? So Maria's question was about, like, so right now, for example, letter, number. But let's go back to where Maria started, which is the idea of like the line. Forget the letter and the number. What I want us to understand is that what everything that I just said about dependent origination, I was doing at the level of letters and numbers. We can do it at this level too, which is a line. What is a line? And what I mean is that a definition or a quality of a line is straight. And what we want to notice is that straight is dependent upon curve, but curved is dependent upon straight. And so these also as just geometric shapes. But this is where we're at a very deep level where at a certain point we presume what the Buddhists call svabhava. We get to the point where we say, no, 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 no. That's what it is really. That's what it is like before all of the psychological projections of meaning. But that's what the Buddha is going to say doesn't exist is svabhava. So in other words, Maria, to go back to your original, the idea of like, is like the letter number? Oh, and we're about to talk about this too. The idea that it is currently a letter and a number and a geometric shape, that's not really true, right? Because that's like pretending versus actually looking at the mind being like, oh, look, a line. Oh, look, a letter. Oh, look, a number. and us asking, where are those coming from in that way? Yeah. Uh, Maria?
So I have a follow up. This is what I was thinking about between the time I last saw you and today. And so it's, I think, right in the context of this thing talk. So I remember at one point we said, you know, so the question is about space and how space enters into this conversation. And is space a thing? I feel like I remember a conversation where we decided space was not a thing, and it was the what created the space for things. But at the same time, we have a word for it, and it's an idea. So is it a dharma? I mean, how is so if space isn't a thing and we have a word for it, what category does that fall into? And how
Space?
do we and how do we relate to it? I mean, I guess we relate to it because we're in it. We are it mostly.
If we were in it, that would certainly sound like a thing.
Sure.
So, and we just said it's space is not a thing.
Right.
It allows for things
Mm-hmm.
in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Really quickly, so Maria's question regarding space is a good one. So the thing about it is, here's a quick reminder of the realm of space. When I first asked, what is that? You didn't say a guy with a whiteboard and da 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 da. Somehow, when I said, what is that? The mind, your mind, isolated and said, oh, he's not talking about that or that or that or that. He's talking about that. And what I want you to notice is, and I do this with the screen behind me all the time, Maria, you've seen this. If I'm talking about the screen, then there's no space between the bird and the flower because it's all part of the screen. But as soon as I start talking about the bird, now all of a sudden there's all this space, meaning the bird now has space around it. But when the bird was part of the screen, there was no space. So this is what I often like to remind everybody from a Buddhist point of view. Space is it's much closer to a dimension of consciousness because consciousness sort of relies on space, what it thinks is space, in order to delineate form. And the reason why I like to use the screen or whatever is because space is up to you. Space is not about the physical natural world. It's about the mind being like, I'm like, how much space? It depends on what I'm talking about, right? Because if I'm talking about fingers, then all of a sudden this is space. But if I'm talking about the hand, space is a little different. And if I'm talking about Michael, all of a sudden space is different as well. So this is where we can get into the realm of space. Remember, there's the realm of desire, the realm of form, and then the formless realm of space. And the reason why you can kind of slip into a samadhi of space, of infinite space, is because there is infinite space everywhere. I use this as an example. This will be my final space example. So if these are faces, then this is space. But if this is the object, then this is space. How about it's all space? Notice that it would be the mind seeing a form that is prohibiting your immersion into the samadhi of infinite space. So, great digression into space. Yay, yay. I have a few more, unless there's any other comments, questions, or ideas. Oh, no, you had one in the comment. You had a comment in the chat.
Oh, I did this
What's
because
that?
then that changes everything.
Wait, I can't see you.
Well,
Well,
if I cover my eyes, so then it
exactly.
goes to the example of sound. And I love the line, a hammer striking at emptiness. When
Nice.
I hear the bell, it's like, what is it? So, and that little thing I post in the chat of just listening. So thank you.
Diane.
That this Well, so when I was young, I'm pretty old, right? So in high school, I took a lot of psychedelics, and nowadays I think psychedelics sound like they're kinder, gentler. But I got really clear. The good news and the bad news was I was creating my own reality. And I can see why, when I read the Steve Jobs biography, he was saying he never trusted anyone that hadn't taken hallucinogens. And what I kind of projected on that was, some people wanted to kill themselves because all of their belief system and
Sure.
these institutional things like ride or die, it's just smoke. I mean, so that's what this kind of reminded me of. And it seems so real. And I have, this kind of like process or this all this software and all of these things, but it's kind of good to be reminded of that it's like all a co-creation. And then some people like, I think you may be talking, this is this because that is that. But then who's the this or the thater?
Excellent. Diane, your comment, excellent comment. And it prompted a very important idea, a most important idea. A most important idea in many ways we hadn't even gotten there yet, but a most important idea about dependent origination is understanding that there is no observer of dependent origination because the very sense of self is more of a product of the dependent origination. So the idea of that we are creating our own reality isn't exactly right, but the last thing you said about we are co-creating, now
Yeah, it's
that,
just a way of saying it because it's just like, well, you
yep,
know, there's an isness and and so you kind of realize, oh, if I'm just like, this is wrong, this is right. Well, it's I call it smoke because
sure,
that's just a way to talk about it, but
yep,
no one can really talk about it, no one can really explain it, and it
yep,
just is, and it's comforting kind of to know and to hear this. And
nice.
that's the good anyway, and I just remember other times when I've come clear with this, it's just like, well, that's the good news and that's the bad news.
That it truly is. It really, Diane, well said in that way. It really is both the good news and the bad news in that way, where it's like you're doing this to yourself, that's the good news. And it's the bad news. There's nobody else to blame in that way. Okay, I have two more, at least two, more important thing. I'll start with the more practical one, and then we'll get to the other one. So there's another, I would call it like another angle or another way to approach this. So we're still talking about dependent origination, but so the thing about it is that actually I'll do the two examples. The first one that we want to think about, this is a very, very basic example, but we want to ask or think about this question of what makes a car go? Like what is the cause, right? And you might say, well, pushing the gas pedal. But if there's no gas in the gas tank, you could press that gas pedal all you want and you're not going anywhere. Or you could have gas in the gas tank and be pushing the gas pedal, but you don't have spark plugs in your engine. You're also not going to be going. So the question of what makes a car go might be a trickier thing to answer than we think in that way. And what I mean is that from a Buddhist point of view, there isn't just a cause. It is what the Buddhists call causes and conditions, that there's an entire set of conditions that need to be set, like you got to have wheels and da 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 da, and there's a whole bunch of causes, not just one cause. All right, just keep that example on the side. Now the idea is this. I've been working on this analogy for a while. I've been sharing it every now and then, but I call it some of you have heard it because I have been working it out it's almost like a stand-up routine, but I call it the mind stew. And the mind stew is this idea that it's about looking at your state of mind, what the Buddhists call chitta, your mind state. It's about looking at your state of mind at any given moment as being like a soup or a stew that you're cooking. And you've been cooking it in a way your whole life. And and the reason why I like this analogy is because when I started coming up with it, I realized that in English, we have all these funny ideas like being bitter or being salty or being sweet, right? Even saccharine, right? You're a little too sweet. But we use funny food language to describe certain mental states like that. And so what I want you to think about is that your mind stew, which is right now, there's a way in which we are all constantly eating of our own mind stew and sharing our mind stew with others. And so at any given moment, let's say I've been bitter all day, right? Like I've just been angry and bitter all day. So I've been adding a lot of bitters to the mind stew. And then you run into me and I offer you some of my mind stew, meaning I share with you, what's on my mind, and it comes out all bitter and angry in that way, right? Well, the first thing I want us to notice from a Buddhist point of view is that you don't get to say, you should have been here last week when the stew was great. That's not how the mind works. The mind is present, and it is only present. And so, no, you work on your mind stew in that way. And the idea again is that you're eating of your own mind stew and you are sharing your mind stew. But now the question is, and by the way, you can think about this from an actual cooking point of view or my mind stew analogy. But the point is that if I made an actual dish, an actual soup, and shared it with you, and you tasted it, does it make any sense to think about the one ingredient that made it taste that way? Does that even make any sense? No, because the final taste is the stew. It's like all of it. And you can't say that it was that last grain of salt that made it taste the way it does. Well, no, that would be ignoring all of the other ingredients that were in there that made it taste the way it does. From a Buddhist point of view, the taste of it is dependently originated from all of the ingredients, not just this one, not just that one. So take this back to my car analogy. What makes a car go? It's not just one thing that makes the car go. Okay, now let's bring this all the way back to Robin's kind of initial inquiry about contemplating things in terms of dependent origination. And the main thing that I've been meaning to keep coming back to all night, from a Buddhist point of view, it's delusional to say that made me angry. that thing, or that thing, or her, or him, or that situation. It is absolutely delusional to think that that singular thing was the one and only thing that made this anger. Nope. It is the entire situation that is making this. Now, the value of this is the super good news. The value of this is, let's say, whatever it is, it doesn't, that's the beauty of this. It doesn't matter. But let's say there's some noise over there going on next door and it's, annoying me. And so now I'm upset. Why am I upset? Because of them. That's the cause. Now, the problem with that is that if I think that that's the cause of me being upset, there is only one possible solution to not being upset. They have to stop. That's it. So, but what I want you to notice, so by the way, Robin, I'm now answering your second question about how to kind of use the wisdom of dependent origination. And what it is it's realizing that if that noise over there is making me upset, there's a lot of things I could do to change the situation. Not just having them be quiet, I could no longer care about it. I could no longer give a F about that noise. And all of a sudden, I'm free of the suffering of the loud noise. And that was only one other solution. There's infinite other solutions when you're thinking in terms of dependent origination. When you are not thinking in terms of codependent origination and you're locked into this idea that that caused this and it is a one-to-one causation, that's the cause of suffering, actually. Thinking that way. If you hear what I'm saying. Okay, so for me, that's the super hyper practical value of dependent origination is the really foolish way that we think about what is causing us to be a certain way. Diane?
I hope I'm not talking too much, but this
Not at
is such an
all.
exciting
Great to hear
topic.
from you.
Okay, a car is a car because of everything. It's because of everything. And then, you know what? And then it's kind of like, and then where's the sound coming from? It's all about the bass, right? I mean, that's what the
Exactly.
Dzogchen people, it's all about the bass. But,
Yep.
again, it's my little infrastructure or my limitation or whatever you want to call this little bundle of this little bundle of humanity right here. So many preferences, anyway, just, those poisons and the toxins. But really,
Yep.
it's all about where's it coming from? So that's my thing is with the sound bothering me. It's like, where's it really coming from? Where's it really coming from? Where's it
Exactly.
all really coming from?
Exactly. All right. Maria?
Oh, just quick comment. I think maybe these teachings about dependent origination are starting to sink in. Like I kind of been thinking a lot about how much more flexible I feel lately, and I've sort of been attributing some of that to how I said that the course on the Avatamsaka Sutra made me lose my grip on reality. And it's kind of that. It's like I've really loosened um, that, and it makes me feel much more like, yeah, but if we just flex a little bit over here, it makes this a lot easier.
Nice.
And if we just let go of that a little bit, what a relief. So maybe that's what's going on in the background. It's like,
Nice.
yeah.
Yeah, the Buddha speaks of a malleable mind. Malleable versus rigid. Yeah, that's definitely what we're working on. Okay. So I have one couple more things, but one very interesting thing, actually maybe two interesting things. Hold on. So if you're interested in dependent origination, there's something you need to know. You need to know that this idea of pratitya samutpata, that's what we've been talking about tonight, dependent co-origination. You need to know that has always been a teaching of the Buddha. So in the original canon, in the Pali Canon, there's many, many suttas, many teachings about dependent origination. It's totally the basis of prajna wisdom, and all of that. But what you need to know is that a few hundred years after the life of the Buddha, there was this very, very important Buddhist philosopher named Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna wrote a lot of poetry essays. And his most famous one is this one, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, the fundamental verses on the Madhyamaka, the middle way. And it's really Nagarjuna, and really in this poem essay, it's really in here that Nagarjuna reaches in to the original teachings of the Buddha about dependent origination and basically kind of goes, hey, did you guys notice? Did you guys notice what he said? And then begins a whole kind of philosophy of dependent origination. And it's the basis of Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, the Madhyamaka school, the school of the middle path. So I want to kind of say a few words about the Madhyamaka and about Nagarjuna, and I want to give him all due credit for having kind of taught these ideas. But he says all the time, this is what the Buddha said. I'm not making this up. So there's one idea that is, if I'm going to attempt to summarize this amazing essay, there's one idea that is just so fascinating, and I want to share it with you because maybe you'll give it some thought. And it has to do with causes and causation. That's what we've been talking this whole time. This idea of like, what caused me to feel this way? What caused the car to go, right? This idea of causation. And so Nagarjuna is really interested in the idea of cause and effect. Classic. This is Galileo. This is classic physics. It's the idea of cause and effect. And you know what we in the Western world think that goes all the way back to Aristotle, at least? It's the idea that cause precedes effect. Cause, then the result. That's the way we think. But Nagarjuna, based upon the teachings of the Buddha, he realized something very interesting about that. And what it is that the cause of something cannot be identified until after the effect has appeared. Now, what happens in Aristotle, we have Aristotle to blame for this. What happens is that in Western thinking, in the Western philosophical mind, the cause is potential. It's the idea that it is potential. It has the potential to cause it. But Nagarjuna spends a lot of time thinking about that idea of a you can say this well in Sanskrit. It's the idea of a effectless cause, by which he means a cause, but the effect hasn't appeared yet. And what he says is, but that's everything. Everything is a cause without an effect yet. And that's how he comes to this realization that actually the cause arises simultaneously with the effect. And a beautiful way to say this, and I'm kind of riffing off of Nagarjuna now. He says something else, but I'll riff off of it. A beautiful way to think about this is to understand that the mother and the baby are born at the same time. And that's because a person isn't a mother until they have a baby. And so at the exact moment that the baby is born, the mother is born. But we think that the mother is the cause of the baby. We think the mother was already there being mom, and because she's a mother, she produced a baby. The baby produced a mother in terms of dependent origination, in recognizing that they both arrived at the same time because they co-define each other in that way. So this idea that the cause and the effect actually arise together, this is in an entirely different model of the universe in that way. Like, and speaking of which, one last idea. So remember what I was just saying about this idea of I called it a moment ago, maybe like 5, 6 minutes ago. I called it the idea of a direct one-to-one causation. Like the idea that I think it was when I was talking about the mind stew, and it was the idea that it was just that last bit of salt that made it taste the way it tasted. Like that was the cause. And it's like, there's not just one cause, there's a whole soup of causes, right? But the Western mind doesn't think that way. The Western physics mind or philosophical mind thinks in terms of like the classic example of a billiard table and billiard balls. And this billiard ball caused this billiard ball, which hit that one and caused that one, which hit that one and caused that one. That is the way that the Western philosophical mind thinks, is this sort of this caused that, which caused that, which caused that. Not a sea of causes and conditions. The Western mind is very linear in that way. But what I want you to be thinking about is this, or consider this. When you're thinking in that direct one-to-one causative way, where you're asking, well, what was the cause of this effect? Oh, it was that. It's a logical question then to ask, well, what caused that? Oh, this. What caused that? Oh, that. And this way of thinking, and it's a way of thinking, but that way of thinking that thinks that this was caused by that was caused by that, that way of thinking leads, well, it leads to many conclusions, but it leads to three seemingly different, but ultimately the exact same conclusions. Thinking of that one-to-one causation either leads to what Aristotle called the prime mover, what Christians call God, or what scientists call the Big Bang. What I mean is that the idea of a creator God or a first cause or a Big Bang, it is the logical conclusion of a certain way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking which thinks that this was caused by that. Now, I spent all night talking about how that was erroneous, to think that this could be caused by one thing. But as soon as you think that way, you've got God or whatever. But I want you to notice that it's a logical conclusion, right? It's like a deduction in that sense. there's another interesting way that this functions. What, exactly what I'm talking about right now. There's another way that the direct one-to-one causation, like it manifests in another interesting way. It's the idea of free will. It's the idea of I'm the prime mover. I'm the first cause. There's nothing before my decision to do it. That's the idea of free will, right? There was nothing before it was just my decision to do this. No, there was a whole sea of conditions that then led to you saying something or doing something. We're going to save the conversation about free will for another night, but I just want you to notice that like the question about whether we have free will or not, from a Buddhist point of view, is very presumptuous. And what I mean is that it presumes the self, meaning that's there for sure. But does the self have free will or not? And the Buddha said, let's talk about the presumption first. And if you understand the presumption of self, if you understand that that's a presumption, meaning there's no self, there's no conversation about free will or determinism because you've removed the premise in that way. So just something interesting to think about regarding all of that. I have one final thing to say. I have to say it, but any questions, comments, or ideas that I might work in? All right. The only last thing I have to say is because we didn't actually say too much about emptiness. Maria brought up space, but space is not emptiness. No, not by a long shot. So emptiness, the quickest way that I could talk to you about emptiness, it goes back to what Maria was getting at or what we were talking about when there was the idea of like, so what is that? And I'm not being silly now. I'm actually talking about, well, I don't know what I'm talking about, but what I'm pointing to, let's say that, right? So the question of like, what is that? And, it's this idea of like, well, is it like the letter I in potentia? Is it the number one potentially in that way? Well, given everything that we've talked about regarding this, especially when I started drawing things next to it and I started changing its nature, right? I changed it from a letter to a number. Well, the idea is that it has no inherent nature. It's neither a letter, nor a number, nor a shape, nor this, nor it has no inherent nature. That's emptiness. But let me show you the flip side of this. I always use this one to reinforce this. You probably think you know what this is, right? And the idea here is that I always talk about how this is my scarf, right? Now, if you are the type of person to say, no, 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 it's a roll of toilet paper that you're using as a scarf. If you're that kind of person that says, no, it's a roll of toilet paper, but you're currently using it as a scarf, then you're saying that it is inherently, truly, really a roll of toilet paper. And this is just a silly game. But it's fundamentally, actually, truly, really a roll of toilet paper. The teaching of emptiness is related to the teaching of dependent origination because basically what we need to know is, and I always use this example, or I often mention What if there was an alien from some other planet where they don't eat, they don't defecate, they don't have bathrooms on that planet, they just don't go to the bathroom. If that alien were to show up, would they see a roll of toilet paper? But what if on that planet they use white cylinders for, I don't know, for like, catching something? The alien would be like, hey, you got a catcher, right? You got a Google clock catcher. We ran out of those. I could use your Google clock catcher. I'm going to be like, a Google clock catcher? What? My point is that it is not a roll of toilet paper or a Google clock catcher or a scarf. It has no inherent nature. That's the teaching of emptiness. In other words, whatever it is dependently originating based upon the alien mind or the human mind, or because it's cold and it's around my neck, or because it's a pillow and it's on my head. It's all going to be dependently originated based upon the soup in that way. But the idea that, oh, no, you're crazy. It's a roll of toilet paper. That is that clinging, that is that upadana to that idea of identity, basically, in that way. So I just wanted to give you a real world example of emptiness. Emptiness means that it doesn't have an inherent nature. But notice that emptiness doesn't mean like, oh, where'd it go? Oh, it's empty. I realized it's emptiness and therefore it disappeared. And Robin and everybody, this is what I meant originally by enlightenment. Nothing's going to change, but everything will change in that way, meaning that the disposition towards it changes in that sense. It all kind of makes sense. Cool. All right. Then with that, I'm going to call it a night, right on time. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you, Noe. Thank you, everybody, for being here.